So Eli, thank you. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. The article or the journal article was pretty dense, so I hope I adequately explain it to you guys to where everyone is able to grasp an understanding of it. So the title of this article was Approval of Cancer Drugs with Uncertain Therapeutic Value, a comparison of regulatory decisions in Europe and the United States. So just a dive into cancer drugs with little to known therapeutic value and how regulatory authorities in the United States and Europe go about approving and imposing post-market studies and obligations. Um, this study investigates how the FDA and the EMA addresses approval and uncertainty for cancer drugs, specifically those that were in early evidence of efficacy and safety. The authors of the study chose cancer drugs because cancer drugs frequently receive accelerated approval due to high unmet medical needs and severe disease burden. To this day, there's still limited treatment and there's still a big market for cancer drugs. To break down the objective of this study, it was to compare how often agency grants approvals, how often they use specific pathways, imposes post-market study requirements, and how many of these drugs are actively on time with their post-market studies, and how often are they complicit. And finally, it's to understand the regulatory consistency or inconsistency and how this transparency can affect overall public trust in these accelerated approval pathways. So to just the main regulatory bodies and pathway that this study goes over is the FDA accelerated approval and the EMA conditional marketing authorization. It's very similar, but they do have their own distinct differences. So if we start with the FDA accelerated approval, it allows market entry on drugs based off of a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. Its clinical benefit confirmed through post-market trials, addresses an unmet medical need in treatment of a serious condition, and meaningful over available therapies. The eligibility for accelerated approval is drugs and biologics must fulfill um, all the criteria, which is address unmet medical needs of a serious condition, provide meaningful advantage over existing therapies, and have shown to be effective on the basis of an endpoint that is reasonably likely to have a clinical benefit. And the EMA's conditional marketing authorization can only be granted for first marketing authorization and must pose positive benefit risk profile and must provide comprehensive data through post-marketing studies. It must treat, prevent, diagnose serious, debilitating, or life-threatening disease, and it must be designated as an orphan medicinal product. The eligibility for that, it only needs to fulfill uh, one of the following, which is to treat or prevent, diagnose a serious, debilitating, or life-threatening disease, is used in response to a public health emergency, and is or the product is previously diagnosed as an orphan medicinal product. Whoops. Um, then we have the evidence assessment of CMA and the conditional marketing authorization and the accelerated approval. Um, Requires a criteria of the conditional marketing authorization requires four criteria must be fulfilled. Positive benefit risk ratio is established. The manufacturer is able to maintain additional data. The product fulfills an unmet medical record, and it benefits the health of immediate availability of the product, and it outweighs the risk of incomplete evidence. For accelerated approval, the same statutory requirements as for regular approval must be met, which is substantial evidence of on efficacy based on adequate, well-controlled trials, sufficient information to determine that the drug is safe. However, evidence standard is a little bit different. Efficacy can be demonstrated on the basis of a surrogate endpoint that was determined to be reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. Um, the FDA accepts evidence that will generally come with fewer, smaller or shorter trials. Failure to conduct post-marketing studies with quote unquote due diligence may withdrawal or approval. And just a violation of these post-market obligations can result into penalties and can get you in trouble. The penalties can go all the way up to $250,000 in the United States. Um, so the methods in the studies that the authors approached were to they came up with 4 steps to compare the EMA's and FDA's handling of uncertainty. Um, the first step was the authors systemically identified a set of cancer drug identification pairs that were judged by regulators to have limited evidence on efficacy and safety at the time of approval and still required confirmation through, post-clinical trials, etc. Approval was done through the EMA, through the conditional marketing authorization or the accelerated approval. And they use this to indicate drugs for which at least one of the 2 regulators considered uncertainty about efficacy and safety at the time of market entry. The second was that they matched this set of drug indications across the EMA and FDA to see if there was any similarities. And third, they publicly went through available regulatory documents to compile information on the EMA and FDA on their outcomes, final improved indications, pivotal trial characteristics, and post-marketing obligations for each drug indication pair. And fourth, they compiled the information and compared and shared their results. So here are the results. To give an overview on how the EMA and FDA's approach drug approval, they finalized a total of 21 matched drug indication pairs and noticed some key differences in the regulatory pathways and outcomes. So first looking at the EMA's approval, 33% of pairs received regulatory approval, while 48% were approved conditionally through the CMA. Notably, the EMA, if you notice, the EMA did not grant approval for 19 of these pairs, which only equated to 4 pairs. Now, if we compare to the FDA, we see a greater reliance on the accelerated approval pathway, which was used in 71% of cases compared to only 24% that received regular approval. The FDA rejected only 1 drug indication pair, or about which only was 5% of cases. In terms of overlap, the way we look at this, only 4 of the 21 pairs were approved under both the conditional marketing authorization and the accelerated approval pathways. This highlights the agency's different approaches to how they want to use their pathways. The most common combinations that can be seen is the EMA's regular approval and the FDA's accelerated approval, accounting for 33%, which can be seen right here. They match with the accelerated approval and the EMA regular approval. The EMA's conditional marketing approval matched with the FDA's regular approval for about 24%. Lastly, if we look at the status of post-marketing requirements, half of the drugs under the conditional marketing authorization have since been converted into full approvals. while the other half still remain under conditional status. For the FDA, accelerated approvals post-marketing obligations were fulfilled for 13 out of the 15 payers, which shows a significant completion rate. So overall, this comparison highlights how the EMA and FDA's diverged in their use of accelerated pathways and post-marketing requirements. It shows that each agency weighs factors differently, often balancing the need for timely patient across with the requirements for robust confirmatory evidence. So in the comparison of post-marketing obligations, the EMA and FDA had differed slightly in their post-marketing obligations for cancer drug approvals, particularly in the number, objectives, and study design characteristics. The EMA imposed clinical marketing studies on 71% of approved indications, most of which were through the CMA pathway, while the FDA required studies for 85% of approved indications, primarily via the accelerated approval. On average, the EMA mandated more post-marketing studies for CMA approvals, which was only 2.3 per indications compared to the FDA, which was only 1.8 indications. Although both agencies required fewer studies for regular approvals. Another critical difference was in population targeting for post-market studies. The EMA emphasized in confirmatory studies in population that directly reflected the approved indication, which in the EMA's case was 87%. Meanwhile, the FDA allowed a little bit more flexibility with only 59% of post-market studies focusing on approved population rate. So 41% of FDA studies were able to target different population, including patients that had other cancer types or less advanced diseases. Overall, these differences show how each agency balances the need for confirmatory evidence with practical considerations like study design, patient population, and influencing how robustly these drugs are evaluated post-approval. So, status of the post-marketing obligations, the median follow-up time for a post-market obligation was 7.25 years, which was specifically it was 6.6 years for the FDA and 6.6 for the EMA, 7.5 years for the FDA. The follow-up period provides a reasonable time frame to assess the progress and fulfillment of these post-marketing studies. For the EMA, half of the approvals with clinical post-marketing obligations had all requirements fulfilled. There were significant delays noted. 5 of these approvals faced delays, and only one approved managed to fulfill all the obligations on time. The remaining 50% of the EMA approved indications had open obligations, and all of them were behind schedule. So this shows that there's a trend of unmet timelines for the EMA post-marketing obligations. This indicates that these areas need improvement for managing these studies. The FDA's record is somewhat different. Out of 17 approved indications with clinical post-marketing obligations, 29% met all requirements on time, while 47% fulfilled their obligation, but still had delays. 2 FDA-approved indications had open obligations running on time, and 2 more had obligations but were delayed. The median delay for FDA obligations was 0 months. This statistic includes 5 cases where manufacturers were released from obligations, so they didn't have to complete these studies. Overall, this status of these post-market obligations shows significant difference in the timelines and completion rates of these obligations between the EMA and the FDA. And the data suggests that while both agencies require post-marketing studies, ensuring timely completion remains a challenge, particularly with regular approval pathways where delay times increase significantly. Here we have the post-marketing evidence generation. The EMA imposed, to start off with the EMA imposed several obligations, including a total of 9 non-randomized studies. These comprised follow-ups of pivotal trials, new trials, and observational studies. Additionally, the EMA required 3 randomized controlled trials with no are randomized controlled trials mandated for 2 of the indications. On the other hand, the FDA obligations included 1 to 2 randomized controlled trials for each indication. The FDA considered obligations fulfilled. For example, the FDA considered obligations fulfilled for brentuximab vedotin, which based on the results of one of the required RCTs, while the drug remained under the CMA provisions in Europe. So notably, the common randomized control trials, as examples, were crizotinib utilized the same randomized control trial in both regions to confirm its clinical benefit. However, the conversion of ofatumumab to regular approval was based on different studies. The EMA required a new RCT conducted in patients with refractory diseases, whereas the FDA's approval was based on a RCT conducted in the first-line setting. Again, this highlights the difference in post-marketing evidence generation requirements between the 2 agencies, and this will later show the discrepancies between these 2 agencies. This is a continuation of this for drug indication pairs with regular approvals under both the EMA and the FDA accelerated approval pathways. The EMA imposed post-marketing studies for only 2 indications, but by contrast, the FDA required post-marketing obligations for all indications. Now, for drugs, the EMA and regular FDA approvals, the EMA imposed post-marketing studies for all conditionally approved indications. However, the FDA only required obligations for 2 indications. The EMA's requirements included 2 RCTs for these conditionally improved indications. This led to delays in confirmatory studies. However, this caused some drugs to remain under the conditional marketing authorization status, and this reflects the differences in follow-up demands and timing between the agencies. The EMA, particularly though, its conditional marketing authorization pathway tends to make a more cautious approach, imposing broader obligations across multiple drug indication pairs, including randomized controlled trials and non-randomized controlled studies. This approach ensures a more comprehensive safety and efficacy data post-approval. This is in contrast to the FDA's accelerated approval, which typically mandates fewer obligations, often centered on a single randomized control trial. The FDA also tends to move drugs to regular approval status more quickly once results from a randomized control trial are achieved. This can streamline the process for patient access to innovative therapies. And this can, if this is not only for patients, but for also healthcare systems, this means that while the FDA may facilitate a faster access, the EMA provides a more robust long-term data on drug performance, contributing to a more conservative but safer approach. Um, this is like I said, these differences do lead in discrepancies in the use of special regulatory pathways. Both the EMA and FDA are generally more inclined to grant market approvals for cancer drugs, but there is limited alignment in the specific regulatory pathways they choose. In the analysis of 21 cancer drug indication pairs, only four were approved through both the conditional marketing authorization and the accelerated approval pathways. For most cases, one agency granted regular approval. Post-marketing studies required by another agency became critical for further evidence. So it just wasn't harmonized. A key case is ponatinib. The EMA approved it based off of a single arm trial, while the FDA used an accelerated approval due to the safety concerns by that same trial that they felt were significant. Um, the FDA required a post-marketing RCT, which was halted early, which ended earlier because of adverse events. The FDA withdrew it from the US market. However, the EMA didn't. They felt that it provided more benefit than it did provide risk. Um, this case, among others, highlights how variations in evidence collection can be interpreted by these agencies and how pathway selection can influence post-market obligations and can ultimately affect like long-term market presence. Um, so this study also dives into the evidence standards for regulatory approval. Um, there's limitations on post-marketing obligations. Despite discrepancies in the use of the CMA um, and the accelerated approval, both agencies approve drugs based off of limited evidence. Um, the evidence in the case of these 21 drug indication pairs was too limited for regular approval, yet more than half of them received regular approval by at least one of the agencies. This suggests that obligations to collect further evidence through an accelerated pathway like the conditional uh, market authorization or the accelerated pathways were not always deemed necessary by the regulators. And it's important to note that both agencies are more likely to approve a drug than deny it. Approving drugs with limited clinical data has become more of a norm than an expectation. This reflects the shifts in an agency's approach to balancing efficacy, safety, and access. Um, this trend has some significant implications because granting regular approval on the basis of preliminary data and safety on efficacy and safety data, regulators are essentially, the way I saw it, was lowering the bar for evidence required for approval. This shift signals to pharmaceutical companies that data traditionally needed for CMA and AA pathways may now be sufficient for regular approval. This this influences the standards in evidence in the industry. Um, but this plays into a role between the dilemma of access. Um, then we can So now it's issues with timely evidence generation in the post market. This analysis highlights significant issues with generating timely post-marketing evidence for drugs approved under special regulatory pathways. 61% of the EMA and 40% of the FDA post-marketing obligations faced delays or were ongoing beyond their scheduled timelines. For the FDA, 7%, there was a 7% rate of delayed ongoing studies and was lower in the past assessments, but maybe due to smaller sample sizes and timeframe differences. These delays echo past concerns that post-marketing evidence generation often fails to keep pace, leaving critical safety and efficacy questions unanswered for extended periods of time. One major reason for these delays lies in the lack of, it could be due to a lack of incentives for companies to prioritize timely completions of post-marketing studies. Once a drug gains market approval, there can be limited motivation for companies to expedite evidence generation and existing legal tools for enforcing these obligations. It could be done, the agencies can revoke approval, like the FDA can revoke approval. Officials are, however, in the case of these cancer drugs, officials can be reluctant to take these steps because of concerns that withdrawal can take away patient access to these potentially beneficial treatments. Um, Stricter enforcement and stronger compliance incentives are crucial for ensuring timely fulfillment of post-marketing obligations. Regulators need the authority to evaluate safe and effective medications, improve transparency through publicly accessible and regularly updated database on post-market obligations. Um, in the case study of in the case study of afutumab, it was intended for treating refractory chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Um, it was approved via the EMA's conditional marketing authorization and the FDA's accelerated approval pathways. However, this decision was based off of early data on a single arm trial. Uh, However, post-marketing requirements had changed. The FDA accepted a confirmatory randomized control trial in a less advanced patient group, allowing afutumumab to be tested in an earlier stage of disease progression. The EMA mandated that a confirmatory randomized control trial take place within the approved patient population to ensure that post-marketing evidence would apply directly to patients with the most critical needs. The EMA required the RCT was completed as scheduled, which led to afutamab's status being upgraded from a CMA regular approval to regular approval. However, the RCT data received mixed outcomes. It did not achieve primary endpoint or improved progression-free survival. There was no significant improvement in overall survival was found compared to physician-selected options, although some secondary assessments showed benefits. This is just a significant case study to look at because it lies in its illustration of the complexities and challenges in regulatory strategies for post-market evidence generation, particularly in the context of conditional approval pathways like the conditional market authorization and the approval and the approval and the accelerated approval. This illustrates the divergent regulatory standards. It's an implication for the benefit risk assessment. The mixed outcomes of this confirmatory RCT underscore the challenges in assessing benefit risk ratios for drug approved with preliminary data. And it also impacts the regulatory decision-making and policy. This case signals to policymakers the need for a more careful consideration of evidence requirements in conditional approvals. If a drug's efficacy or survival benefits remain unconfirmed in post-market studies, it raises concerns about the adequacy of the current condition approved. Um, and it also insights into ethical and practical challenges. The case reveals ethical tensions in drug development, particularly in the dilemma of continuing rigorous trials after market when patients expect access to new therapies. The the EMA's insistence on trials within the same patient population, despite the FDA's alternative, reflects differing priorities in managing these ethical considerations while seeking robust evidence. So this is just like oh, this is a real life example on how the difference in regulatory authorities can affect how patients see and trust these new developments of drug developments. And it could also be the same for medical devices, but the reluctantness to be a little bit more stricter and reinforce harsher deadlines for these pharmaceutical companies can be due to the fact that these are treatments that are for rare diseases or for patients that have limited available therapies currently. And so this is the overall study of this article. And I'll take any questions at this time, if there are any.
Thank you, Eli. So, I'd like to open the floor for any questions or comments.
Hi, this is Dr. Liberti speaking.
Hello.
Hi, that was a wonderful presentation. Very detailed and the thing that I like about these kinds of analyses is that they bring out two points of view. You know, the authors, I don't want to say obviously, but I know a little bit about them, and they have a bit of a distaste for accelerated approval pathways, as you can sort of gain from the way that they've written their article. That's okay, you know, because some of the data suggests that there's problems. So I have two questions for you. The first is, you know, I believe you said it takes about 6 to 7 years, or took, for this cohort to meet their post-approval commitments, somewhere around there, 6, 7 years. One of the things that people have said leads to that is that the post-approval commitment was unrealistic to begin with, that the way that the post-approval commitment protocol was designed, or the enrollment criteria, or the population. And that is not necessarily only the fault of the company, but also of the agency that agreed to that post-approval commitment. So do you have a sense of balance in terms of, you know, whose problem is this? Is it the agency's problem, the company's problem, or everybody's problem that we're not meeting these commitments?
I think it's the company's problem for initially to um agreeing to these obligations. I feel like some of these obligations, especially in post market, can have a little bit of leniency to them because they're already out there. I feel like the way that in my personal opinion, more I gauged more with the FDA's approval, not the FDA's approval, the FDA's post-market obligations where the company was allowed to go outside the approved indication population. They were able to gather studies with people with a less who had less progression in the disease. So I do think it's the company's problem with kind of first off agreeing to these obligations that the agency presents. But I also believe, especially with the EMA, they do tend, based on this article, to be a little bit more conservative in their post-market obligations. So I also feel like they need to lighten up a little bit if they want results in a timely manner.
Yeah. You know, if I remember right, and you can correct me on this, in the European environment, the EMA, if the EMA gives a conditional marketing authorization to a product, the labeling of that product, I know in the past, used to have a triangle stamped on it. And the triangle signified that the product had been approved under a conditional marketing authorization, and that therefore still needed to have confirmatory trials and all the things you so beautifully explained. Let me pose a question to you. If you're a patient and you have a particular disease for which there is an unmet medical need, you're prescribed a drug and you get this package insert and you open it up and there's that triangle. What are you going to do?
I would definitely consult with my healthcare provider. It does raise some questions on like, is this safe? Do I take it? What are the studies being done? Are they doing the studies right now? But in the case that I'm suffering a disease with unmet, like with no new available therapies, I think you you have to, well, you don't have to, but what other choice do you have? I would take it. I would take it, but I do think it's important to have that label because you're essentially lying to the patient if you don't have it.
Well, remember that an agency's mission is to approve products that are of good quality, are safe and effective according to their benefit risk balance.
Mhm.
So even though there may be, let's call it, I hate using this term, less experience, less than what? Less than a lot? What does that mean? So there was sufficient experience for the agency to make a valid benefit risk decision about the safety and efficacy at that point. But there was also sufficient uncertainty that they requested additional information. So I don't think we can say that at the time of its approval, we didn't know its safety and efficacy. We knew what we knew, and it was good enough to approve at that point. But we would always want to collect more. And you're right. If you're a patient in that situation, it's a tough decision, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That was a very, very nicely presented summary.